Thank you for joining me today on Islands of Sanity. I'm your host, Carolyn Baker. And as we enter the spring season of the Northern Hemisphere, we're seeing much higher than normal temperatures as spring appears to be coming earlier than it ever has in at least over 100 years, perhaps more. But that's one of thousands of indications of climate chaos in our time. Humankind's awareness Humankind's awareness is now being saturated daily with the reality of catastrophic climate change, and yet many people can't wrap their minds and hearts around it. For that reason, millions of people, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, are suffering from climate anxiety and climate grief. My guest today, Jack Adam Weber, has written an absolutely unique and validating book on why we're all suffering emotionally from climate chaos and how we must respond emotionally as well as physically. Jack's forthcoming book, Climate Cure: Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet, is a supportive, practical toolkit for navigating the difficult emotions of this crisis. As we know, for all the distressing facts about the climate crisis, there's scarcely any help for how to emotionally and spiritually cope with it. Instead of falling prey to eco-anxiety and eco-grief, you can use this book not only to cope with climate distress, but also to leverage your difficult emotions into potent forces for hope and regeneration. This is now acutely in our faces as the planet is being confronted with the coronavirus, and I'm sure we'll get into some discussion of that today. But let me tell you about Jack. Jack Adam Weber is a traditional Chinese medicine physician, poet, environmental activist, and a yoga and qigong instructor. He's also the creator of the Nourish practice, an earth-based rejuvenation experience of healing self-care. Jack offers presentations, workshops, and readings integrating holistic medicine, environmental activism, deep ecology, poetry, and meditation. You can learn much more about his work at jackadamweber.com. Jack, welcome to Islands of Sanity.
Thanks, Carolyn. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and I wonder, can you start off with telling us why you wrote Climate Cure?
Sure. First of all, it's perhaps apropos to start off with a bit of an absurd joke, but I wrote the book by accident. And when I share that, it took me 5 years to write it by accident. And when people ask me that, why I wrote it or how the process was, and I tell them that, they're incredulous. And the book began as an introduction to a collection of poems titled Rebirth, which I'm going to have out this year. And so the work really grew totally organically from the inside out as I was trying to encapsulate and present these poems in the context of climate crisis and collapse. And as I was contemplating that yesterday, I remember when I sent you that introduction, I was asking for a little guidance, and I think had gotten to 16 pages at that time.
Right.
And I sent it to you, and I said, "Hey, is this too long for an introduction to a collection of poems?" So anyway, it grew from 16 pages to 400 and something pages over 5 years. And I began writing it. I mean, as soon as it took a greater form than just an introduction, it became a way for me to communicate what was inside of me as to how I perceive the roots of climate crisis and how we've gotten into this predicament. So I think, more than anything, at first, it was just like an outpouring of a lot of integrated perspective from my different fields of interest and passion for how we got into this mess. And then it naturally became, because it was sort of founded on depth work and reconnection with the natural environment, I realized that it was a great tool to just navigate the chaos that we're in. So it's really a book about, I mean, the publisher chose a subtitle that I wasn't crazy about, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. Yes, that's true. That's, you know how that goes. I see you
Yes,
smiling.
yes,
But it's really just to let people know it's a book about how to cope through this.
yeah,
And even if I care, like how to thrive through it and how to care and how to be involved and also how to go through a process of initiation and transformation and to just face and get involved with life. And a lot of that hinges upon, for me, and the argument that I make is how fluid and how emotionally intelligent we can be.
right. Yeah, and you speak a lot in the book about needing body-centered wisdom as we navigate the crisis.
Hmm.
Because our bodies, we forget that we're animals, and
Yeah.
animals navigate everything pretty much through their bodies.
Yeah.
So you're speaking about needing body-centered wisdom as we navigate the climate crisis, and I'm wondering what that means for you. Why do we need body-centered wisdom?
For me, I think it comes down to contacting a sense of innocence and a sense of primalness, in a sense,
Mm,
that we are animals,
yeah.
and we're animals with big brains and fairly developed neocortexes, and unfortunately we've moved into, I think, a term that you've referred to a lot, which is the cerebrosphere, right?
Hmm.
And I think deeply embodying ourselves is the essence of our connection to the natural world. And it's the essence of our connection to ourselves and to our intuition and to our gauges, right? How we gauge our place in the world and our sense of belonging and how we're affecting the world and how we're affecting one another. And I think a big problem with human development and industrial development is we've left this sense of body-centered wisdom, the traditional wisdom from traditional cultures, and just having that body-centered locus that Carl Rogers would talk about in terms of how we navigate the world, and that keeps us in balance with the environment. Um, I use this term in the book that we're walking, talking chunks of earth,
Hmm.
and I think to remember that sense of primalness with the earth, and that our emotions are actually what we've developed over time evolutionarily to have that calibration with our environment and with one another, so that our emotions are ways of remaining sustainable, right? And remaining in a sense of harmony with our environment. So I think that the sense of body centeredness comes from that. And also I I feel that to be deeply embodied is to be emotionally viable, right? Because our emotions keep us out of descending into ourselves and descending into the unconscious. So when we're able to deal with a lot of the difficult emotions that climate crisis certainly brings up, we're able to become much more fluid in our world and fluid in ourselves, and to embrace a bigger sense of ourselves with the world. Does that
So
speak?
absolutely true. Yes. And I was just thinking about how this crisis in many ways is pushing us or calling us back into our bodies.
Yeah.
And just given what's happening right now with coronavirus,
Hmm.
this isn't like an epidemic of the mind, it's an
Hmm.
epidemic of the body,
Hmm.
physicality. And,
Hmm.
and I think personally is directly connected with climate chaos.
Yeah.
There are conspiracy theories about this was made in a lab somewhere for 1,000 reasons. But what I went to immediately when I first heard about the pandemic was, yeah, when human beings kill off a whole lot of species that can eat up bacteria and pathogens, what do we think is going to happen?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think That's true. And it's also, I think just this mind body split that's happened, right, keeps us sort of in this intellectual appreciation of the world without a sort of deeper, more intuitive appreciation of our environment and how forces in the environment act to keep the environment as a whole in balance.
Yes.
Right? So, whatever the ultimate purpose of coronavirus or any illness for that matter is, right? I mean, I wrote a whole unpublished book about illness and how it really helps inform and transform us and keep us in balance. And one of the notes that I have here, for our talk today is just this, and I want to mention it now because I
Sure.
it's coming up is you know, I've come to view climate crisis as our own darkness, our own denied darkness descending upon us from the outside,
Hmm.
right? So, like, we've screwed up so much as humanity for all the beauty and amazingness that we have, right? We've screwed up in really key ways. And I think a lot of that has to do with the denial of our shadow for so long, which you've written wonderfully about. So, so having nature act upon us in this way is that invitation to initiation, that invitation to, hey, this is an illness, this is a disease, this is an imbalance, and here's your last chance
Hmm.
to wake the hell up.
Absolutely. And the first place that humans tend to go with this crisis is, oh my God, we got to do something, and it's all out there, and let's do it out there.
Mm.
And we don't as readily go to the need for inner work and explore, what is this asking of me internally. A lot of people think that inner work is self-involved and self-serving, and I wonder how you respond to that mischaracterization. And by the way, I love it in the book when you say selfishness done right becomes selflessness.
Mm.
Say more, please.
Thanks for pulling out the quote.
Yeah, yeah.
It's always nice to have it come back. Um, yeah, I think that you know inner and outer are always in a constant dynamic, right? So that we can't obviously we can't ignore outer life and we can't ignore inner life, and I don't think we can get hung up in either one too much, and there has to be a reciprocity there. And I go into some of those dynamics via yin and yang, yin being the interior and yang being the exterior, and how that's an ancient symbol of the Chinese medicine that I practice, and part of the poetics and the metaphors of the system that I love that have really helped inform me about climate crisis are that we have to have this inner outer dynamic.
Mhm.
And it's just a given. I mean, Jung talked about this. Jung was, as you know, he was influenced and informed by Eastern philosophies. And if we, Jung said that if we, uh, what the dynamics that we ignore inside become fate outwardly.
Mhm.
Okay, and so that refers to, relates back to what I just said about climate crisis being our own darkness manifest. And all right, so I'm going to pause every once in a while to just kind of get back on track. Yeah, so if we don't deal with our own inner world, and in the book I talk a lot about our wounds, right? The wounds that we've carried that affect us emotionally, that cause us to act out the dynamic of hurt people hurt others.
Yeah.
So we know that, right? We know that from psychology, and you know that as a psychologist and a therapist. And Jung also, he was one of the first that really promulgated this view of how we displace our hurt. And so so that's part of the heal yourself to heal the planet kind of a thing, that you know, we have to clear up our inner lives to a degree, and we need the resources to do that. And that's part of why, social justice is really important too
Mm.
for climate justice. And because if people don't have a sense of support, if people don't have the resources to be able to work their lives out and deal with our pain, then we're going to displace a lot of that pain onto others, including the earth. And one of the beauties that comes out of inner work, and especially grief work, so there's a whole chapter in the book dedicated to grief and to grief work. And for me, that's the way that, I've called grief like the great polisher of the soul. And it's what helps dissolve our pain. And if
Yes.
we don't have a connection with grief, our pain builds up and it backlogs inside us. And that eventually spills out, and it spills out every day in the way that we treat the world. And the more alienated we become with the world, and listen, this might be a crux that I'm talking about, but it's also exacerbated by the toxic system that we live in.
Right.
And so all this contributes to this buildup of pain. And so unless we have a way to deal with that pain, we're just going to create more and more damage to the world. So, and just the last little seed thought here is, staying in touch with grief for me, is actually difficult these days. I've grieved a lot, and I imagine you have grieved probably more than I have. But but staying in touch with not it doesn't even have to be grief that like takes us down and dissolves us, and it doesn't have to be heavy grief. It's just like a sense of sadness, even just in a sense of remorse that's part
Yeah.
of grief, that keeps us vital, and it keeps us in touch with caring for what's around us. So that's just how I see the inner work piece is so important. And of course, we, if you feel really stuck and you can't do inner work, then do some outer work, and as you start working with people, as you work with animals, maybe as you work with gardens, it's like that can soften up your heart, so we can also just act as much as possible. And that, that cycles back inside us to to waking our hearts up, right? And so we create that reciprocity.
Absolutely. And that leads me to my next question, which has to do with personal collapse. You talk about the beginning, you talk about the process of conscious personal collapse as a way of preparing ourselves for climate collapse and the collapse of industrial civilization. And you also say that collapse is a taste of death. Now, you yourself lost most of your life on the big island of Hawaii with the eruption of the Kilauea volcano in 2018. And then you were further terrorized by the Thomas Fire in Southern California, both terrifying experiences of personal and climate collapse. Could you say more about that and what you learned from those deeply distressing experiences?
Hmm. That's a big question. um, what comes to me first is a really, it might sound trite, but it's something that I really got, and I'm actually reminding myself of it more and more these days, is to enjoy the process of life. And I had built a home with my own hands, and I created incredible orchards of fruit trees and vegetables in Hawaii on the 5 acres that I was living on. And I did that all by hand without a lot of power tools and machines. And I enjoyed a lot of that work. And of course, I did it mostly in my 30s. And I did a lot of it at night, actually, after work. So I enjoyed getting out there in the jungle and the drizzle and just doing a lot of work at night. Getting a little nostalgic here.
Yeah, it's okay.
um, so anyway, but there were processes of building what I had in Hawaii that I didn't like so much, and that was building my house, and it was a big pain in the ass for most of the time. And so I think, when it was all taken away, I had remorse about the years that I wasted, stressing out too much about the house and everything that needs to happen with building a house, especially out in the middle of the jungle. Um, and So the taste of death part is that I remember in one of our grief circles on the Big Island, there was a woman who's a Buddhist practitioner, and we both acknowledged one day in this grief circle that I created to help us sort of just share our stories and support one another. Um, we both acknowledged how losing a big chunk of one's life and is like prepares us to die, really. And so I think through any catastrophe, and climate crisis is no exception, that if we can get the deeper lessons and remember these sort of perennial truths of how transient everything is. And it's not, I have an issue with transience too, that a lot of people just check out and spiritually bypass because nothing is permanent, right? But it's, it's not that. It's just realizing what's truly important in life. And so I've really come even deeper into a sense of community. And I'm just reminded of this Wendell Berry poem as I share that, but really coming into the lap and coming into the circle of our neighbors. And that's really what I've tried to create a lot of here in Ojai. And it began in Hawaii. And I think this circles back to, like, what does crisis show us, and what does collapse show us, and what does having a lot of your life pulled out from under you show you? Like, what does it do for you? And for me, it's taken me into the simplicities of life, those things that the meaning of life is right now. And it's and it's in every moment, just that we share love and we share care and we get involved and we have a sense of passion, a sense of creativity. And even when we don't feel those terrible things and we're on the other side of that, right? Like if we're in depression, which I've also been through, it's you know we just got to make lemonade. We have to keep making lemonade, and not just for ourselves, but especially for the community in which we find ourselves, and the greater environment.
Absolutely. And you just dropped a term that I'd like us to pursue for a couple minutes, and that
Okay.
is spiritual bypassing.
Mm.
What without using any four-letter words because we can't
Yeah.
do that. What is that? Some people might not know what that is. I talk about it all the time, but some people
Hmm.
might not be familiar with the term.
Yeah. So spiritual bypassing technically is just using spiritual precepts and tenets to avoid our humanness and avoid the messiness of life and avoid uh, relationship difficulties and losing your job and getting sick and having stress and you know but really responding to that in a human way. So it's sort of just to stay in this sort of loftiness and ethereality, and of course that has nothing to do with being walking, talking chunks of earth, right? Or being embodied or being connected to the world. So that's spiritual bypassing. And just to dive in real quick, I use a term in the book called, I came up with it when I was writing it, and I was just like, it was like one of those aha moments, and I was so happy with it. And I coined climate bypassing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And climate bypassing is like an extension of spiritual bypassing. So if we're talking about being emotionally viable, right, and staying connected to life, you can't face climate crisis and be spiritually bypassing. And
Right.
you have to be connected to your humanity because it's going to make you hurt a lot. But within that hurt is a lot of meaning and a lot of purpose and a lot of passion, a lot of like, this is a sense of belonging.
Yes.
So climate bypassing is the sort of climate version of disappearing and going into denial.
Well, thank you for that, which leads into my very next question, which is, I had this comment about the book. There's a brilliant crux of the book, I think, in a statement that you say, which is, if I can't welcome difficult feelings or even tolerate them, I will likely avoid the issues that trigger them. So say more
Mhm.
about that, please.
Okay. Mm. So I I'm really glad that you saw that and noticed that, because for me too, it's a crux of the book. And what does that mean? So one of the quote unquote arguments that I make in the book that I've shared a little bit about already is this notion that if we're not emotionally viable, right? If we're not emotionally fluid, and I go into some of that fluidity in the book through the five elements, otherwise known as the five phases of Chinese medicine, and all those phases of life represent wholeness, and they represent our connection with nature and the interface of human being with the natural world. So that's how Chinese medicine was founded. It's like, this is you, you're part of this, you're part of yin and yang. You're a little part of it. You're an expression of this universal energy that's balanced between dark and light, and even more differentiated into these phases. And these phases are the seasons of life. And these seasons of life operate in all of us all the time, within an hour, within a day, within a week, within a year. Excuse me. And so, what was the question again? Oh yeah. So if we as human beings are not connected to nature and connected to the rhythms of nature and how those rhythms operate inside of us and in relationship to the environment, then we're going to be out of sync, and we're going to create problems unless we self-correct them. So the emotional piece in this is that, would you read me once more just that quote? Just bring me back to that.
Yeah, you said, in the book, if I can't welcome difficult feelings or even tolerate them, I will likely avoid the issues that trigger them.
Right. Okay. So that the root emotion, we know this from neuroscience. We also, it's also explicated in Chinese medicine that fear is kind of like the deepest, most primal emotion that we have. And this aspect of fear is that I discussed something in the book that I refer to as our fear mark. And it was an image that came to me one day when I was writing that, and I liken it to the mark that water makes in a barrel, right? Mm-hmm. So like if the water level goes down in a barrel or in a dam or something, you kind of see where that water was. And so I liken that to our fear mark. And the fear mark is the amount of fear that you can tolerate before you turn away and go into denial.
Mm-hmm.
And with that said, I also discuss in the book about healthy denial, right? It's like we all have to be in denial about certain things. Otherwise, we go mad in an instant.
Yes.
And I've been there too. So so as we can increase our fear mark, and that means as we can increase our tolerance of fear, we become more able to face climate crisis. We become more able to engage with one another. We become more able to look at our own shadows, because all these things require us to stomach difficult feelings.
Right.
Right? So we're not only afraid of fear, right? Like FDR said, right? And I think he hit it right on the button. It's that, so I dedicate 2 chapters in the book to fear and anxiety, to working with fear and to working with anxiety. And they're very in-depth chapters. And there's an aspect of fear that's realistic, right? Some fears are realistic.
Absolutely.
Some fears are unrealistic. We just, it's like speaking in front of people is, I mean, the fear is real until it's not, right? So it's like public speaking. They say that we're more afraid to speak in public than we are to face our own death. And so differentiating between real fears, right? So if you're walking along a high cliff ledge and you're afraid of falling, well, that's a real fear and it helps you, right? So you stay to the, to the side of the mountain so you don't fall off. But, if you're afraid of asking someone out for a date or or speaking in public. Well, that's a kind of fear that you want to be able to face. So what FDR said was, it's like you need to not be paralyzed by this kind of fear. And a lot of people, as you know, Carolyn, report that they feel paralyzed by fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so learning how to work with fear allows us to come out of the prison of the mind, that it's like, oh, there's a fear, there's grief, there's helplessness, there's remorse. I'm going to move away from that because I don't want to feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that also ties into a lot of our cultural sort of privilege and superiority here, that we have a culture in which you can live in a sort of fake environment and a fake life where you don't have to face a lot of difficult feelings, or if they come up, you can find a way to distract yourself. And a lot of that distraction is the same kind of bypassing that we were discussing before, where
And don't you think, if I could just interrupt for a second, don't
yeah,
you
go
think
ahead.
that there's a bit of entitlement in particularly white privileged folks, that I shouldn't have to feel this, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's ironic because a lot of the white privileged folk, I'm white and privileged, is, we do a lot of the polluting.
Yes,
I
yes.
personally don't do a ton, but I do more than a person in a village in Africa. So yes. And so I just want to try to like circle back to this fear mark thing, so if what's required is to be able to have the knowledge and to have the savvy and the quote unquote emotional intelligence, so that we aren't stopped by what we think we can't handle. We
Mm-hmm.
can actually handle a lot of things, but a lot of people just stop. It's like,
Yeah.
the knee-jerk fear thing. And so learning how to work through fear, learning how to work with anxiety as well, so that these things can be managed and also mined for the important messages that they do have for us. So it's a process of dissecting, and I go through that a lot in the book, how to
Yeah,
work
you do.
through,
Yeah.
these things. So yeah. So just to sum all that up, it's just such a rich topic, and I really want to do it justice. And so the last point about that is that, which I just sort of forgot. Oh, right. Is that, we can't really interface with the whole crisis unless we deal with our fear. And, I haven't really done a survey to find out how many people, as if I could get a straight answer, how many people have actually, shied away and don't get involved. I mean, part of being a climate activist and, writing about it and being involved with it, as you know, it's like a lot of people just don't pay attention to it. I mean, why don't they pay attention to it? I mean, that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
But all right, I'll stop there.
This is very juicy.
I hope so.
So, part of our privilege is that, and it's also part of being human. The first thing that comes up for us is this fear when we start hearing the facts about climate change, and we go into survival mode. Oh my God, how am I going to survive? What do I do? And and that's very understandable, and nothing wrong with that. But one of the things I love about your book, and I would have to say the number one takeaway from this book for me, and there are so many that it was almost impossible for me to choose one, but for me, the biggest wow of this book is the way you help the reader reframe facing climate catastrophe from a place of fear and survival to a place of care.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if in this planetary rite of passage, which I've written and talked a lot about, in which we're immersed, we stop fighting climate change, stop trying to mitigate it, stop pleading with governments to solve it, stop even trying to save our own lives, and view it as the most stunning opportunity we've ever had to care for the earth and for each other and for ourselves. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be climate activists or do external work on
Mm-hmm.
the predicament, but to reframe it from, oh my God, how am I going to survive, to how am I going to care for myself, for others, and the earth is absolutely golden for me.
Wow. All right. So you want me to just sort of respond to
Oh, whatever.
some of that? Okay.
You got
Um, well, you said a lot, so I'll try to cover some of it. Yeah, so there's the care aspect, and then right, the non-binary sort of just, coming into a sense of, the several words come up for me. I think one of them is just brokenheartedness, number one.
yeah.
And then it sort of pings back to this aspect of staying in touch with our grief, right? Like just being affected by the world, letting ourselves be
Yeah.
deeply affected by the world brings out our care. And
Yes.
I'll be transparent here that I've noticed, I think, in the process of writing my book and being cooped up and, redoing stuff for the publisher, that I've lost touch a little bit with my own care, ironically enough, through writing the book. Just, I won't go into, you've heard me complain about that process and working with the publisher over the last little while. But right, so staying in touch with brokenheartedness, staying in touch with being affected, being a sensitive person. And there's so many influences and forces these days to move us out of that sensitivity, right? Because it's painful and it hurts. And one of the dynamics that I go into in the book, which is, comprises the last 6 chapters of the book, is what I call our triangle of resilience relationships. And there are 3 of them, right? 3 facets for the triangle is a relationship with ourselves, and that's where I discuss a lot of the inner work. And then a relationship with the natural world,
Mhm.
all aspects of it. And then our relationship with one another and community. And I think that having that foundation allows us to face a lot of the difficulty of climate crisis, allows us to be more resilient, to raise our fear mark, to be able to feel our grief, to be able to hear from others. And this is one of the beautiful things about being in Circle out here. It's like I also created this climate change discussion and support group,
Mhm.
as well as Extinction Rebellion. So I founded a local chapter of Extinction Rebellion here last year, and we've been at it for about a year. And it's like I look forward to all the meetings, and I look forward to climate change discussion groups, those support groups. We're kind of taking a break right now, but what comes out in those groups a lot is like you just get to be around other people. You get to be around other people who
Yeah.
actually care.
Yeah.
And being in community that cares and having like-minded people is a gift in itself. But
Absolutely.
it's like I discuss this in the book. Like we get to hear from one another, and you get to hear and you get to feel aspects of yourself that you've forgotten,
Mhm.
right? Or that
Absolutely.
and so it's this beautiful way to kind of just be in the crisis together.
Mhm.
Um, so coming back to care, and the broken open heart is like, I'm convinced that if you care and if you're being an embodied human being, then your heart has to be broken these days.
Absolutely.
There's a line. Are we doing okay on time? Am I
Yes,
okay?
we are.
Just
We're fine.
okay. In the rewriting process with the publisher, I wrote this line in the book, and I wrote, "We're all brokenhearted." I started out this paragraph. We're all brokenhearted to some degree.
Yes.
And my editor at the publishing company, railed on me for that. She says, "You can't say that. You can't just assume that everyone's brokenhearted." And I said, "Really? Like, what human being is not brokenhearted to some degree?" And so I, I changed the sentence to, "Everyone I know is brokenhearted to some degree," because you couldn't argue with that, right?
That's true.
You don't know who I know.
You betcha.
But anyway, so that was a bit of a tangent. Okay, so initiation, caring. So I think that once our hearts are broken open enough, it's like that's how initiation happens. If your heart's not open, then you can't be initiated. So initiation, breaks our hearts open. And there's a concept in the book that I describe as sacred permission. And I've written about this previously, but it fits in nicely here. That sacred permission is the process of earning the right to affect the world significantly,
Mm.
right? And our current president is an example of someone who apparently hasn't gone through sacred permission. And I think that elders in the past and in traditional cultures have, and
Hmm.
that tribes leaders have, and shamans have, and that's why they were chosen to be those kinds of people and put through trials to become leaders.
Hmm.
And sacred permission is like going through suffering, and going through a brush with death so that we become people who have had our hearts broken so that we can empathize, right? And so that the way that emotional pain changes us and imparts wisdom, whether we want it or not, that is part of this initiation. And I think once our hearts become broken, it also sets up this sense of death and rebirth inside, right? So that
Yes.
pain becomes beauty. The more beauty we have, the more joy we have, the more we're going to grieve, the more we're going to hurt, the more we hurt them. This is if we're working with it sustainably, if we're working with it in a way that makes us better human beings. And so as we enact the cycle, which is the cycle of the 5 phases, right, of Chinese medicine. So all this is like, these are these ancient perennial truths, and they apply as much to climate crisis as anything. And so this word that came to me too when you were sort of saying your part about it, of relationship, is that if our hearts don't break, then we don't come into relationship with it. And that's why there's this cerebrosphere sort of relationship in the mainstream with climate change. For even people who are paying attention, it's like, oh, it's just something we have to fix,
Right.
right? And no, it's like, we not only have to address it, but how do we see ourselves as intimately related, intimately in relationship with climate change, right? It's like, humans created climate change. So of course we have to be in relation to it and ship to it. And how deeply we perceive that relationship and how deeply we can explore the roots of that is the degree to which we will transform, and we will maximize this opportunity. Because now, it's knocking on the door. Climate crisis is knocking on the door and saying, how deeply can you wake up?
Yep. Exactly.
Right? And so the broken open heart, fostered by and supported by grief and tenderness and love and even joy. I mean, if you don't have joy in your life, it's like you're not going to care about life very much.
That's right.
Right? So carving out a place for joy, carving out a place for all of the emotions, right? The full heart and full cycle, to be able to engage with the process so it's a relationship. So we're not only just fixing climate crisis, but we're learning how to live with ourselves.
Hmm.
We're learning how to not displace our pain via hurt people, hurt others onto the environment and onto one another. So these are like the hidden causes of climate crisis. And that's a lot of what I try to bring out in the book. And it's, for me, it's a passion, because it makes us holistic, right? Fuller human beings. Because once we go fix climate crisis, like fixing cancer or fixing the next disease, it's like we're still left with this kind of broken system and this broken network of relationships.
Thank you for all of that. So let's change the direction here just a little bit. Not only do you write incredible prose, but you're a fabulous poet. And I'm wondering if you'd like to share one of your poems that relates to climate cure.
Okay. I have several poems about here. You asked me to read a poem, and I don't know which one to read, but I'm gonna feel into it for a sec. And
Okay.
I want to give you an invitation here. We're doing okay on time, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So how about, I've said a lot. What if you share just some of your, like what stood out for you in our conversation? And you just share some of your wisdom, because you're a bottomless well of that. And I'll sort of listen to you as I feel into a poem to read. How's that?
Sure. Sounds good. Well, as you were talking, you mentioned the word initiation several times, and I want to make sure that people listening to us have a clear sense of what we mean by that. And I think what we both mean by that is something related to rite of passage. And I've been writing and speaking a lot about that in the last couple of years. The notion that the climate crisis and all of the global crises are pulling us and inviting us into a rite of passage.
Mm,
When you think about the traditional tribes, the traditional indigenous groups, that they always had for young people around the time of puberty, they had some sort of ordeal that the child was prepared, maybe for many years, to go through, that would force the child down into the psyche, into their depths, and cause them to reach down into that place and touch those resources that were bigger and greater than themselves, that carried them through that ordeal, and that brought about not only adulthood, instant adulthood, but brought about a transformation of consciousness, so that
mm,
the young person was more fully integrated, more fully whole, and could go back into the community and take his or her place as a leader, and eventually as an elder. But
mm,
that brush with death, which you mentioned, that rite of passage was a brush with death that took them down into this place through the ordeal. And so I have been writing and speaking a lot about how I think this is exactly what's happening, that the
mm,
climate catastrophe, the collapse of industrial civilization, collapse of the economic systems, and so on, are inviting us and compelling us really into that place. And we could resist it and say, no, I'm not going to feel this. No, I'm not going to look at this. Um, and Jung wrote a lot about rites of passage. He traveled all over the world to indigenous cultures to kind of study it. And he came back to the West and said, well, we don't have those traditional rites of passage, but what we have are little, quote unquote, initiations, little rites of passage in our lives on a daily basis. We have to face things like divorce. We have to face things like the loss of a job, or a terminal illness, or the loss of a body part, or whatever. And that the more we can look at these as opportunities to make that descent into our depths for the purpose of learning and transformation and growth, the more prepared we are to face the largest initiations, ultimately the big one, death.
mhm,
So we are totally on the same page about this from what you're saying.
mhm.
And I think it's really important that people understand and are able to reframe our current crises in that light.
Yep. Well said.
Thank you.
And I just want to pull out. I can't remember the exact line, but it was, but from your writing that I really appreciated about this aspect of initiation, and it refers to what I was talking about with sacred permission, right? And if
Uh-huh.
we don't go through sacred permission, we end up being, a megatoxin like our current president.
Yes,
And how you said that if the the traditional cultures have understood that those who don't go through initiation, right, to be matured, to become sacred stewards of their world, become a danger to the community,
absolutely.
right? And that is key. It's like we've lost this sense of initiation, and we've lost the sense of the benefits and the graces of the broken open heart, and what comes with pain and what comes with suffering, and everything in our, it's not people's fault necessarily. It's like, some people are just called to do this work, and
Mhm.
our culture does everything it can to avoid pain.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Anyway, I read this one. Never mind. Reminds me of this poem, but I won't go there right now. Anyway, I think that's a really, really important point, and I think we need to do that together. We need to get together
Mhm.
and be in circles together, and just drop out of the rat race as much as we can. And this other idea that came up is minimalism, right? So minimizing our lives as much as possible, so
Yes.
that we have time to dedicate to self-care and to our own work, and to work with one another, and to work in the world in ways that really matter.
Yes.
And I think that's a great challenge and a great beauty of our times too, that it's like you have a great excuse to just kind of drop out of life and live in a way that maybe you've just dreamed of when you see the hippie traveler, or the gypsy or something, and like, oh, how great that life would be. And I think that's a great way to live right now. Anyway,
I think we're
so
going to be forced on one level or another to live those kinds of lives. And a lot is probably going to be taken away from us, perhaps more than we can imagine.
exactly. And that was a whole other, I'm living in my van right now,
Yeah.
and it's like, part of me feels like, oh God, how do people judge me? And the other part is like, I freaking love it, and I have
Yeah, right.
time to dedicate myself to things that I care about. Anyway, so, all right, so should we take a pause, and I'll read a poem?
I don't know if we need to take a pause, maybe a couple deep breaths, and
Well,
you
that's
can
what I
read a
meant.
poem, and then we're going to finish up.
All right.
Yeah.
So this is a poem from a collection that hopefully I'll have out this year if I have time to do it, and I'm gonna try to make sure I do have time. But it's the collection is titled Rebirth.
Mm.
That's birth, EARTH, and this
Rebirth,
poem are
REBEARTH.
yeah.
I love it.
Okay, it's titled Peace for Our Times. Peace for our times. There is no more time for quiet love. There is no more time for quiet love. A complacent peace that harbors tranquility without weeping for the sea, surging and seething with injustice and cruelty. The desertification of our minds, the deforestation of our hearts, and fishing out of our souls, robbing us of freedom in the name of protection, robbing us of freedom in the name of protection, poisoning us with mutations and mercenary calories in the name of halting starvation, or each individual life like yours or mine, piling stones at the shore, content with shallows and the barring of fathoms, practicing isolation in the name of satisfaction. There is little place now for convenient compassion and covert pleasures. There is little place now for convenient compassion and covert pleasures. For if you are still secretly seeking to lose yourself, your courage and your care in the comfort of private love affairs, remember the heart of the world winces, grimaces, as it watches you slide back into the cycle of selfish suffering. This time, please don't stop at the lip of the personal circle. This time, please don't stop at the lip of the personal circle, thinking you've made it home. Use that momentum to spiral down, exalted in the fight for a common fertility. The roiling heart, a storm of outrage from the heaving depths of our bodies for the precipitation of sanity, the durability of beauty has become the urgent call for our times. O rain, rain down on us, Great Spirit. Awaken our thousand petals to invigorate our every able limb, our taproots of grittiest wisdom, so we may sift through the sludge formed between our complacency and your call, deliver essence once again as the outpouring of love, fiercer than any peace we've known.
Thank you so much, Jack. And finally, where can we buy Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet?
Uh, the only, it's not out yet, right? So it's coming out in September.
Uh-huh.
Everything goes okay, and you never know. So September, and it's on Amazon right now.
Mhm.
It's on the Barnes and Noble website, places that I don't love supporting very much. So you can find it there. You can read about it. You can pre-order it. You can also wait for it to show up on my website, which it hopefully will one day.
And that website is jackadamweber.com.
Yeah, and I just want to share, Carolyn, that at my website under services, there's free downloads, and I have a couple free downloads there. One is a piece on anxiety. It's an excerpt from the book. And another one, just because we're on the subject, is a bunch of tips for navigating depression. Yeah, so there's a good chunk of an excerpt from the anxiety chapter there at the website.
Thank you so much, Jack. Today I've been speaking with Jack Adam Weber, author of the forthcoming book, Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. And listeners, may I suggest that before you leave this podcast, you make a donation to Islands of Sanity as your token of gratitude for the podcast and for the quality of guests that we're committed to having here. And also, if you want to contact Jack and learn more about his work, you can do so at jackadamweber.com. Until next time, let's work together to create islands of sanity in seas of chaos.